was put away and eliminated. And all of his work was confiscated. Yes?
I heard he wasn't going to be forthcoming in all of his work, and that's part of the reason why.
Well, he wasn't forthcoming because he knew what it was being used for. So there was some semblance of character there. But, if you read about his personal life and his family life, you can see that he had difficulties and maybe wasn't the nicest person to be around. But that's, again, personal matter. He's not here to defend himself. But here's the most important name that you should remember. Dr. Ewan Cameron in Canada. 1940s, 1950s. His work became the basis for monarch programming. He was from Scotland and moved to Canada and operated in Quebec and Ontario and worked in mental facilities where he would perform intensive electroshock therapy on patients. He would also keep them in deprivation, induce sleep, induce waking periods, create very unpleasant circumstances in order to entrain the mind into being something else. Literally, to break or fragment a person's personality. His work, successful with patients in Canada, was then brought to the United States. Hence, we got Candy Jones. And from her, many, many thousands subsequently. There may be some monarch people in this very room. Most likely there are. He was known for his brutality with his patients. And just before this actually occurred, there was a doctor, Albert Hoffman, who worked in Basel, Switzerland. And he worked for Sandoz Labs. And he was experimenting with rye fungus and developed what we now know as LSD in 1938. By the way, he went on to form Hoffman-LaRoche Laboratories. But in 1953, the CIA purchased 100 million doses of LSD from Dr. Hoffman in Switzerland. They said for experimental purposes. 100 million doses. And as you may know, in the early 50s, that they purchased this in 1953. And as you may know, subsequently, they performed tests on military personnel, CIA personnel, and the general public without their permission, or without the participants really knowing what was being given to them. One very famous case in New York in the 1950s was the CIA agent who jumped to his death from a hotel window. You remember that story? Only recently did his family sue the government and actually receive the settlement. His children, grandchildren, received the settlement. And they had his body exhumed And they actually found that he was dead before his body left the window of that hotel. His skull was fractured in a way incompatible with a fall from the building. So he was murdered and thrown to make it look like a suicide, and even on suicide note.
Were those doses used for the 60s and the,
I'm about to get to that. But you should also know in the 1950s and 60s, as close by as Pennsylvania and New York City, the government sprayed bacteria and viruses and narcotics in the atmosphere to see how it would travel. Those of you who've ever gone along the Pennsylvania Turnpike know those tunnels that go through the mountain. There's I think 5 of them that go through the... Well, in the 1950s, during 1955, during Thanksgiving week, the government sprayed influenza strain that they created in those tunnels as the holiday travelers passed through with their vehicles to see how it would spread and who would get sick. They also paid the city of Winnipeg, in Manitoba, Canada, several $1 million to dump from airplanes virus and bacteria over the city to see if it would infect any of the population. And the mayor of Winnipeg agreed to that. They also sprayed nuclear or radioactive material in the subway systems of New York in 1950s and 60s to see what would happen. They never told anybody they did this, and only recently have they revealed even a small part of it. Only recently have they revealed that in the Navy in the 1960s, they purposely gave injections of illness to sailors to see what would happen, and people died.
What is it with the West Nile disease? What kind of sickness do they spray there? The West Nile disease.
Yes.
They spray. This is not.
It has nothing to do with West Nile
I know.
illness.
What kind of sickness is that they spray there?
This has to do with what we call a microplasma. It's not a bacteria, it's not a virus. It's actually smaller than that and requires special equipment to be seen. It's a third category of infection and disease that only recently has been revealed. In fact, it's the cause physically of fibromyalgia, which up to recently doctors said was a mental illness, which actually all illness is mental illness. But there actually is a microplasma that causes this. So West Nile disease does not exist outside of the Nile Valley. That's why it's called West Nile disease. It doesn't exist in areas that don't have the same climate. You understand?
Yes, but the thing is, 2 years ago, they wrote Italian TV, another newspaper, when they wrote spray, close your windows, blah, blah, blah. Last year, they told you when afterwards when they did it. This year, they just talk, but they don't let you know anymore when they spray. So
They're spraying everywhere. It just showed up in Ohio. It just showed up in Louisiana. It's constantly moving west, 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 west until everything is covered. And the reason is they are creating illnesses to eliminate certain segments of the population. Animal population, by the way. Let me continue. We left off here with the LSD. That's what I'm going to talk about now. Timothy Leary who was at Harvard University and was funded, now watch this, funded by this organization. What is that?
National Institute of Mental Health.
National Institute of Mental Health. Where have you seen that before? Think of a cartoon. It's called The Secrets of NIM. There was a whole series of videos for children not long ago. I believe it was about a mouse or something like this. So this went from a government organization to a child's movie. Now, NIM, or National Institute of Mental Health, became the funding source for MK Ultra. And that was back in the 1960s. And Timothy Leary worked for the Illuminati and used guinea pigs